Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
We are today with Miles Greenberg, a performance artist. His work consists of large-scale and sensorially immersive and site-specific environments, and his work revolves around the physical body in the space, sculptural material, the body. Miles, you started very young because your career starts when you are 17, if I'm not wrong, right?
That's correct.
And you said many times that it was much better to learn things in the world by traveling and by human experiences than going to universities or schools.
I don't think it's necessarily better. It happened to be better for me. I think and it's something I pride myself on, that I managed to kind of create my own education, out in the world. I think that when you're working in a medium where there aren't very many precursors to your format, especially, you sort of have to experiment. And the nature of my medium in particular is that it's something that requires an immediate interaction with the world. I can't exactly do what I do, hold up in a studio and then present it when I feel ready. It sort of, the act of creation itself has to happen in front of a live public, So yeah, I guess like having that proximity with culture and with people and with the world was more helpful to me.
You say that you were mostly raised during your youth, childhood and youth, in a white people environment. Of course, you had a Jewish mother, so she might have been rather possessive, maybe. Therefore, you didn't explore in your young age the aspect of your being also black in the black world. Is it true that through your work and your art, that's the way you discover your other identity?
I don't so much see it as a binary, because I don't think I read as a binary. I think I read as a unit. I feel like I might be just as much of a binary as somebody with non-interracial sort of parents, So definitely there was some self-discovery in there, but I think it's mostly centered on this feeling that I had, not of sort of belonging to any particular culture, but of or any particular race or background, but of kind of just first and foremost belonging to myself. I think that blackness to me was sort of a fluid and abstract thing because, I didn't grow up in a specifically sort of black environment as many specifically African Americans do, or, I'm Canadian. Again, Canadian is a very different sort of, even more, I think, fluid identity than American, where we don't sort of have such a staunch sense of self that is so like immovable as sort of Americans do, or as historied as many Europeans or sort of Asian people do, or even African people. In Canada, it's the only sort of people that really have a claim to the land are Indigenous people, and I think that we were quite, at least in my generation, conscientious of that. So you rely quite heavily when you grow up in Canada, in present day, on your histories, on your family histories, and I don't really have a family history. And growing up in a space where I didn't look like anybody around me, I sort of had to create an identity. And it was later that I drew on other spaces of kind of cultural fluidity and where people kind of created their own identities. I took a trip to Haiti a few years ago, where Haiti is a space extremely hallowed on sort of ritual and their traditions, but that are made up of many fragments of bits and pieces of traditions from Africa, of imported Christianity, of imported African religions, and of indigenous religions. And they created a country that is for the liberation of Black people, and people who look like them. It's around a visual and a sort of a present day feeling, as opposed to like a genetic per se heritage, So I'm kind of interested on my approach to Blackness was always one where I was kind of learning what my Blackness was to me in public, through trial and error, through experiments, and through what my community contained.
We spoke about two minorities being raised Jewish and Black, and discovering your negritude, your being Black. And also in many interviews, you talk about also being queer, a third identity of yours. All these identities together created let's say, the roots for your performing arts?
I think before you know what you're doing, you tend to want to know who you are. I think that starting so young and jumping into sort of a public expression so early on, first and foremost, I had to know who I was. And if you go far back enough, you'll see really the evidence of someone who is 18, 19, figuring out exactly where they sit in the world. And I think that the process of that led me to an expression that I think doesn't necessarily hinge on those identity politics. I mean, I want to be sort of very cautious of that too. I don't make work about my identity, but my identity is in the DNA of everything that I do, inevitably. And, I create universes based on my identity because out of this sort of loving gesture to myself and to people who look like me, and give myself the permission to give other people the permission to create a universe of creation in which I am universal and I am the default and neutral, and being Black, queer, Jewish, all of these things in my world and from my lens is the default. And I think that, look, growing up with all of these sort of intersections and looking towards the classical canon, right? Like, what do we consider art? Who do we consider the great masters? We look at Rembrandt, we look at Caravaggio, we look at Leonardo da Vinci, we look at these depictions or Greco-Roman statuary, which is one of my biggest sort of inspirations in even my performance work, where Black people, queer people, people with different bodies, people with differently abled bodies will look at these bodies and these iconic images and have to make a translation. We have to sort of translate what those bodies mean to us. And I think that anybody should be able to look at my body and translate what it means to them without having to fixate on it.
They say that in order to prepare your performances, you give a lot of attention, obviously, to your body, to your diet, to your life, to your restrictions. Can you describe this? And this is before you start a performance, right?
Yeah, I work quite rigorously to achieve the images that I have in mind, because the truth is that I have no idea whether or not what I'm going to do is ever going to work. I don't rehearse. I don't practice. I really just sort of create a scenario, and I have to have the sort of ideal physical ability under those conditions to be able to execute them. Because when I'm actually doing it, let's take, for example, Oyster Knife. It's a piece where I walk on a conveyor belt for 24 hours without any breaks. That piece, I had no idea whether or not I was literally going to die doing it. I trained very heavily. I prepared. I stopped drinking for 6 months. I stopped eating certain things. And I was like, okay, well, this is 150% of what I can do to prepare. And I'll just try it. And the first time I ever did it, the first time I ever walked on the conveyor belt was in front of a public. So it's that element of risk that also allows for, I think, a lot of serendipity and a lot of chance and a lot of beautiful mistakes.
Let's introduce you. How old are you now?
I'm 24 today.
How tall you are?
I am about 1.91, 2. I don't know.
How much you weigh?
70 kilos.
And this is the ideal fitting to do what you do. I mean, for instance, there is one experience you did not very long time ago to stay a long, long time inside. I think it was like a box or something with insects in the box.
5 hours.
What kind of insects, and how is it possible to survive in these conditions?
Those were moths. Specifically, we had owl butterflies and atlas moths. And I have this phobia, mortal phobia. I have no idea where it comes from, but just since I was a child, of like moths, like large moths with eye patterns, these like sort of defensive patterns that they have on them to scare away predators. They make my skin crawl. So this was like a limitation that I had that was so physical, so visceral, so deep in my DNA that I was like, well, I have to find a way to confront this radically and just absolutely head on. So Marina Abramovich asked me to produce something for a durational performance for 5 hours, carte blanche, for her program on Sky TV. And so I came up with this. This was my first idea. And she was like, absolutely. I have a lot of gratitude towards her for
you started working with Marina Abramovich in Greece, no? When you were younger, you went to sort of kind of school, no? That she was having, and she became your friend.
Yeah, originally I met her when I was 17, actually, way before that. So we did a workshop together in Greece, which is now the workshop, which eventually became the workshop, which is Cleaning the House, which MAI, the Marina Abramovich Institute, does for the public now as a public offering, quite routinely with trainers, etc. But I did it with her and 3 other artists. And we spent 5 days, no eating and no speaking together on this island where she was the only one who was instructing and giving sort of, exercises in her method as sort of preparation that she's developed over the years for her personal performance practice. And a lot of those have come into my practice as well. She's been my mentor and extremely generous with being sort of a constant source of advice. And I actually went to go see the artist as present when I was 13 with my mom in MoMA in New York. And that, I think, was probably my first encounter with performance art. So it's been a long time connection.
You also worked in Watermill with Bob Wilson. You learned theatrical. Bob Wilson, a very famous theater director. I think you spent some time with him, and it would be interesting to know which is the difference between a performing artist and a great actor on stage.
Yeah, I love this question. Bob Wilson also is somebody who I think taught me a lot, and Watermill was a great experience for that reason. He is so decisive with every sort of decision that he makes. And I think my work has got a lot of scenography in it and its thinking, and a lot of like mise en scène and installation. So that a lot of that was kind of, definitely drawn from there. But my mother was also an actress, actually, for many years in the theater, in Buffon Theater. She did Jacques Lecoq and worked in Paris for a decade. So there's definitely, I think, an intersection there. But I personally have avoided theater all my life. I did it once. My friend and neighbor, actually, Jeremy O'Harris, wrote this play called Black Exhibition. He also wrote Slave Play, which was on Broadway for quite some time. And while Slave Play was on Broadway, I was in this off-Broadway production, just trying it. And it was so intense and so different, the repetition of every single day, the exact same lines, the exact same things. I thought that the sort of the collective experience of it felt like a performance work for me, like a performance art piece, because the repetitiveness of the experience of being an actor and having to sort of deliver the same thing in the theater over and over again is somehow almost like a ritual unto itself. But the experience for the audience, I think, is very different, But
what is a performance artist? Yeah. I mean, in a way, you are yourself the work of art. You perform in a place where there is a public or not a public. The work of art, if I am a collector, for instance, or a museum, or I can have a performance of yours, but can I have an artwork of yours?
Let me put it this way. I think performance art, and this is the way Marina puts it, at least, performance art, the knife is real and the blood is real, whereas in theater, it's ketchup and a plastic knife, something to that effect. I believe that for me, performance is something that you cannot rehearse. It's something that happens almost more like a circle than a line. And it's not point A to point B. There's no fixed point of view. You can't look at it just from one sort of angle and get one story. You have to be able to circumnavigate. You have to be able to look at it in 360 degrees, look at it from the front, from the back, from the side, and there are all kinds of secrets, because I think that those secrets are secrets to the artist too, because when you're performing as a piece of performance art, you sort of don't know typically what's going to happen. And the reason that I'm so attracted to duration, to the scale of like 7 hours minimum, typically, to 24 hours, to multiple days, to, the longest I did was 8 days.
And what did you do in 8 days?
I was spending 8 hours a day lying on a piece of steel, being covered, from the ceiling, if this was in Bangkok, with sugar syrup, basically, for 8 hours, and just sort of dripping with this syrup. And by the end, I would get solid almost after 8 hours every day. And this for me is so important because 8 hours is unwatchable. You can't sit and watch what somebody's going to do for 8 hours, and you can't plan what you're going to do for 8 hours. So there's all these sort of visceral and extremely human moments that happen where all of the mistakes and all of the cracks in it, where the body just takes over. For me, it's like voodoo. It comes out of the ether and it possesses you. And that is, for me, performance art. It's something that moves you rather than something that you move. And it's something that you see.
Could you be, if I am not wrong, you and sometimes the people who compose the scene with you are live sculptures, right? But if I am not wrong, you also did a couple of real sculptures.
I did, yeah.
And therefore, would you like to become a sculptor at the end of the day?
You know, I've always admired sculpture, and I've always wanted to be a sculptor, actually. You know, I just didn't really go to school for it. I think that sculpture came to me very naturally because the way that I always wanted my performances to be viewed were very much in line with how I was going to go view sculpture. I mean, my ideal art viewing experience was always going to the Louvre and walking through the marble halls, or kind of the way that I could navigate around La Victoire de Samothrace or these other works that you know are going to be there forever. There's this total permanence to the experience, and where you feel like you are completely free to get what you want of that experience at any point in your life. You know, there's a belief that it's always there for you. And I kind of wanted that to be the experience that I recreated with human bodies, with human flesh. Of course, there's no way to get human flesh to act like marble, but if for, you know, some hours, somebody has unrestricted access to that space, then maybe there's something very similar. And maybe there's a contact that happens there that's almost kind of healing. Sculpture, it had to happen organically. It couldn't be like an end goal. I couldn't force myself into it. But eventually I had an idea that I think worked very well. And it was scanning the body in motion with flawed technology that basically created all of these duplicates and all of these distortions when I scanned a body in motion. And what I did was I scanned live performers, myself for the first 3, and sort of the upcoming will be others, but in performance, basically. So it's sort of like taking actually like a moment, like a few seconds from a performance, almost like a very short film, and turning it into a volume. And my dream was always to make bronzes. Of course, those for the moment have been a little bit out of reach. But I, basically the first 3 sculptures that I've made were out of this material that actually you would use to create a bronze. So they're actually fully functional bronze prototypes that if you were to mold them, you could cast them. So it's almost sort of like perpetually in motion in that way too. They're unfinished. And I see myself going more in that direction in future, but it's where they meet that I'm really interested. You know, the fact that a sculpture can come from a performance, a video work can come from a performance and be treated like a body. I think the point of departure remains the same no matter where I go. And that's where I feel like I'm at right now. I don't think that any of the work is really about me, although my body figures in it a lot. I don't think that self-portraiture or using your body as, you know, yourself is necessarily ever really about you, or nor does it like have to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. I don't think that, you know, Cindy Sherman is making work about herself, you know, nor is Sophie Calle necessarily, even though it's personal stories. It's not really who I compare myself to a lot, but, you know, just examples. Like, I think that for me, it's that my body is what I have control over. And so it's the medium where I know I can be the most effective and the most incisive. And when I work with other people, I always put my body inside of it, even when I'm with dozens of other performers, you know, because not only that, but I take responsibility for the fact that these are difficult. These are sometimes a little bit dangerous. And I want to make sure I would never put anybody in a situation that I haven't already put myself in for using the flesh as a medium. I think it's very important to consider the ethics of your medium in that way. And for me, using my own body is sort of like just a pragmatic gesture. It's somewhat of an ethical gesture. And it's just what I know.
Today you are in Reykjavik. We are in Reykjavik in Iceland, but basically you started your career, or you spent a lot of time in Paris, and since a while you moved to New York. Why did you move?
I actually started my career somewhat in Beijing. I moved there first from Montreal. But in Montreal, I was doing stuff. It's just not on the internet. But in Montreal, I was performing in squats and artist studios and all kinds of like underground spaces and nightclubs and with noise musicians. And then I moved to Beijing to work for a choreographer, actually as an intern, as a translator for Edward Locke. And I studied languages, and Mandarin was one of them. I spent a few months there before I then moved to Paris.
How many languages do you speak?
Roughly 7.
What do you speak? Chinese, French?
Yeah, French, English, Italian, Mandarin, German, possibly, Spanish, possibly. I have a base in Russian. I don't use it anymore. It's been a while.
Not at the moment.
Well, not at the moment. And I speak like a 6-year-old. So maybe let's say 6.
But yeah, sorry, we're talking about you going from China to Paris, yes?
Yeah, I ended up doing
Montreal,
workshops actually
China,
in Paris in movement in École Jacques Lecoq, and yeah, that's sort of where I learned a lot what I do now, and I was studying basically just every movement technique and theory and school that I could get my hands on. And then after about 3.5 years, I found there was a bit of a lack of opportunity, especially I think in Paris for young Black artists. You know, I think there's a fixation in France on fashion and what is fashionable. And not to say that that's a bad thing, but there was sort of a fascination with me as soon as I felt like I was being interpreted as like an African-American, like foreign imported kind of artist, you know, like then people were interested in me. People would offer me opportunities in English, but when I spoke French, you know, people sort of ignored me because I don't think that they're quite yet, things are changing, but I don't think that in France, people are really quite in touch with the diversity and the depth of the local scene or their local scenes. I still have so much love for Paris and I owe it a lot, but I had to leave to do the things that I wanted to do. And New York.
Also because you showed one of your first performances at the Palais de Tokyo, no? The famous museum in Paris.
Which is my favorite museum probably in the world. And I owe that to Vittoria Matorese, who's this incredible curator there of performance and who is really, I think, one of the people who's doing some of the most sort of interesting, you know, pioneering some of the most interesting kind of work right now in new media in the city. But yeah, I think there's something about it that just felt a little bit stunted insofar as the conversation around, especially, you know, artists of diverse backgrounds. And again, it's already changed an enormous amount in 3 years since I left. It just wasn't there at the time. New York is my home now, and I'm very, very happy there.
Why? Because America is going through big crises also, right? Political, social.
Sure.
We had coronavirus. There is a war in Russia. I mean, there are many things. And New York has suffered a lot of that, no?
New York has suffered a lot from that. But there's something perpetually... I went to Louise Bourgeois show at the Met right before I left for Europe. And there's this one quote from her. Even though I am French, I cannot think of one of these pictures being painted in France. Every one of them is American from New York. I love this city, its clear-cut look, its sky, its buildings, and its scientific, cruel, romantic quality. That's it for me. You know, there's something very sharp, and I feel very inspired there right now.
New York is home because you're there, you prepare your performances, maybe, or whatever, but then you work all over the world, right? I mean, your performances are taking place everywhere. You must be traveling quite a lot from one place to the other.
Yeah, and I think New York is a nice place to come back to, but I spend almost no time there. You know, I think that one of the biggest sort of privileges that I've had in my life, especially given the background that I have that we talked about, given, you know, the sort of fluidity, I think, of Canadians in general and of my particular family and the way that I was raised by my mother. You can either be from nowhere or you can be from everywhere. David Hammond said, I'm from nowhere, and that's a beautiful place to be. I feel that very deeply. I think for all intents and purposes right now, I'm Icelandic being here, you know, and then I'll be American when I go back to New York. And tomorrow when I go to Paris, I'll be French. And I think that that's the future.
And why were you inspired by Haruki Murakami?
Haruki Murakami. Yeah, for the Palais de Tokyo show. I was so taken with his sort of surreal sensibility in After Dark. And there was something so beautiful and poetic about, to me, containing something in, you know, it's a novel that happens over one single night from a certain hour to a certain hour. And just having the idea of sort of a containment of time like that, it's obviously reflective, I think, in my practice, you know, this sort of temporal kind of like element, but also just like opening it to these surreal images that are not necessarily explained, but that you can feel very, very, very deeply. And I remember there's one scene where this woman goes into the bathroom and she fixes her hair and she's just in the mirror and we're seeing her kind of comb her hair a little bit and fix herself. And then suddenly she leaves and then the reflection is still there fixing its hair like this. And it's never explained. And then we move on to the next thing. And I think that is fabulous. I think that that's exactly how I like to think in my work, where it's like there are these things, these really magical moments that happen that can't be explained by science, that can't really be explained by spirituality, that can't really be explained by words, but they happen and then they disappear. And I think that's who we are, you know?
What are you performing in Reykjavik now? And what are you going to perform in Paris?
I'm not performing in Reykjavik. I spend a lot of time here. My partner lives here. So I'm half the time in Reykjavik. Here, I'm just here to see some nature. And then Paris, I'm going to have some meetings. But yeah, no performances until October. October, there's a performance.
You're working on something new?
I am working on a couple of new shows. Yeah.
Where these shows will take place?
I'm not allowed yet to speak on specifics, but one will be in Amsterdam at the end of October. And then one will be in New York at the beginning of November. And it's two of the most, I think, probably important shows that I've ever done so far. I'm very, very excited about both.
You cannot talk about them?
I'm not yet allowed to say where they are specifically, but New York and Amsterdam, November and October.
Can you at least tell me if they are going to be very long lasting? Are you going to be 8 days, 7 hours, 22 hours?
Actually, these are two very different works, and neither of them are necessarily going to be traditional performance pieces. One is actually going to be a sculptor show in New York, and then the other one, which will be up for several months, and then the other one is in Amsterdam at the end of October, will be a performance, but where the public is also invited to perform, which is something that I've never done. It was a challenge actually from Marina to do this, and something I've never ever done. I've never had the public perform before.
When you perform normally, you're there alone or still or sitting in a position or lying in a position for hours. Are you aware of what's going on around you? How do you perceive the public? Because after all, when I go to the theater, let's say, one feels a bit ashamed to go away because you are in the middle of a play and maybe you go away. So it's a sign that you don't like it. But as obviously you cannot stay 6 hours, or you can stay a little bit in front of us, and therefore you go away and the artist is still there or is still doing whatever he's doing on his own scene. So how do you perceive the public that goes and comes and looks at you? You feel like an animal in a cage, like if you were an animal at the zoo? What do you feel?
No, but this is an excellent question. I don't think that there's necessarily like a dynamic of subjugation in that way. I really try to sort of avoid that, especially given the nature just of those dynamics on a societal, sort of a social level, given that I use all Black performers and myself, but I think that the gaze, it's very loaded. It's something that I use contact lenses in all of my work, opaque white contact lenses. So if you actually look at the eyes of all of my performers, they're completely covered with a white film. So the performer can't actually see for the most part. When you're wearing these, you can only see shapes, very sort of vague shadows. And for the audience, they think that you're completely blind. So they're actually sort of not fearing that exact moment that you're describing, where you have to stand up in the theater because you're not happy, or because you have to go to the restroom, or because of anything else. There's not this disruption. So automatically people are a lot more engaged because they feel suddenly very opened up to their own personal experience. And they have the control in that moment where if they want to look close to you like this, or if they want to stand far away, take photos, or talk to somebody. I mean, I have absolutely no problem with however somebody wants to consume my work. There's no sort of, formatted proscenium kind of relationship. And I think as soon as you take that away, especially when you're sort of, dealing with subject matter just inherently, that is sensitive to people, especially in Europe, I find questions on identity politics or racial dynamics or things like that. There's always this kind of like, am I subjugating them? Do they feel subjugated? Can I have this relationship? Am I racist? All of these questions where you suddenly feel witness going through these things, and therefore you can't go through them. This sort of protects, I think, both the performer and the viewer from that experience, and just gives them something very universal and open-ended to work with. And that's what I kind of was talking about, again, the sculptural thing with the Winged Victory of Samothrace. I can go and see that figure and feel what I need to feel for as long as I want, whenever I want, and however I want. There's no preconceived format.
You are in an interesting position because you are linked by birth with the two communities, the Black community and the white community, right? And therefore you know them both well, and so on and so forth. Now things seem to have completely changed, right? After years and years of white artists, writers, now there is a greater interest in the world of Black people, which is the world of Black writers or artists, actors. What do you think about this? That nowadays the world seems to prefer to be more interested in the art, in the culture, of the black world, more than the white world today. It's not only a politically correct change, but it's a big change.
I mean, I see what your question is. I don't know if I agree with what it alludes to, because
but that's the feeling I had in my 2 trips in New York in the last month, where publishers,
of course,
or museum people, they told me, now it has changed. We are more interested in that kind of literature, in that kind of art, because the world is big and we have to open to a larger view.
There has definitely been a focus on a cultural inclination towards a cultural reparation with and reconciliation with not only Black people, but all discriminated people. The dominant culture, let's be clear, still is white and straight and cisgendered. I mean, I think that, of course, there is a much bigger dialogue and a much, space that didn't exist 5 years ago, space that didn't exist 2 years ago for young Black artists, young queer Black artists, young trans artists, young artists of all abilities and diverse backgrounds. But I don't necessarily believe in the fundamental reorientation of the fact that our global sort of Western culture. I still think that it is an extremely, and I mean, this is like the broadest question in the world. I still think that there's something extremely patriarchal and white supremacist about the arts. We still look at, white bodies and white people as neutral territory for the exploration of the whole gamut of human emotion. And Black people in any art form, be it music or dance or performance art or painting or theater, are kind of expected to illustrate a very specific kind of pain to somehow absolve a white audience of its responsibility towards it. I mean, there's so many sort of complex interwoven politics to that kind of like seat at the table that I think, of course, is worth celebrating sometimes. But I just think that there's so much more work to do before we can ever get to a place where we're using those terms of like the world is more interested in, because that's still so loaded. And my work is not about race. It's not. But I think that there was definitely a moment where, as recently as 2018, where I was very convinced that I had to make work about race and about Black pain, just in order to have any kind of space at all. And I still didn't get the space that I wanted. It was harder work. I think personally, I think that if I were white, I know that the work that I'd be doing would reach a wider audience. That's a fact. I think that that's a fact, and it's not to say that I would change anything. I don't think any Black artist would want necessarily to change anything, or a Black person about their parcours. Maybe, I'll speak for myself, but I just think that it's already sort of an inherently racist actually point of departure to think that we are favoring Black people for any reason other than it being a first initial step towards cultural equilibrium, which we nowhere near have yet.
If I am not wrong, that as you are ultimately, even if you're an old performer now, because you started so young, but you're still very, very young. So you probably have a very interesting life in front of you, right? To see all this kind of social human changes, I mean, it will probably take some time, but maybe in your lifetime you will see many things happening, right? In that sense.
Oh, absolutely. I know I have an interesting life ahead of me. I mean, it unfolds every day, But yeah, I mean, I can't even stress enough how absurd the notion is that we would ever be like, at this point, like Black culture is something that is formulated around a very fragmentary sort of history that has come out of a lot of pain, obviously, of suffering, obviously, but a lot of also, hope and belief in so many things. And that has created a language around itself that I don't think can ever be separated from those histories. And I don't think that, like, people have said it before me a lot, that we'll get to a place where we're reversing those, any of those things or really repairing any of them. I just don't think that, I don't think I'll see that within my lifetime. I can only maybe conjecture that my kids will see that within their lifetimes or my grandkids. But those changes are so much bigger than the tokenism, frankly, that we still sort of operate on right now. And there are things that I know that my dad went through that I'm still going through, so it's a little deeper. And I think more I grow older, the more I know, and realize that those structures don't die with people.
Yeah, but just to finish the interview, what is very interesting in all that, right, is Canadian, Jewish, Black, but ultimately you started your life and your career, your real career, as you said, in China, which is a completely different world. And it is different because of the people and because of the politics also, no? And it's the other world somehow today. How was it to start in China and how different it is from the Western world today?
I'll be honest with you. I think no one's ever been so interested in my identity. I mean, I'm flattered, but it's definitely, I think you've taken more of an interest in it than I ever have, which is great, but I think that at least in my personal parcours, and again, this doesn't necessarily have to do with my work. And I just want to make that clear. But like in terms of, I guess, as I grew as a person and as an artist, China felt like somewhere where I could kind of maybe explore somewhere outside of the paradigms of, as you might put it, both halves of my culture, So it was sort of like, of course, it's not without histories there. I mean, China and Africa have histories. China and African America, have histories, and China and white people obviously have histories. China is also somewhere that has an enormous sort of, political landscape of it, unto itself, that I was essentially leveraged the privilege of not being involved in to have a space to work and think outside of my world and discover. I was 18. But it was kind of like, it was a culture I was always sort of fascinated with because of its complete farness to me. And also the sort of, the way the language was structured. I just liked that it was so far outside of my personal langage and structures and whatever. It kind of flipped everything on its head that I understood, linguistically speaking, right? So I just, I think it's really important as an artist to kind of continue to find methods and ways and places where your whole sense of self gets completely like bouleversé. So it was also somewhere where I felt very independent because Mandarin is not a language that either of my parents or any of my family can speak. So I felt like I could kind of stake a claim somewhere as the beginning of my kind of artistic identity, somewhere where there was no connection to the rest of my life. I feel like I'm somehow maybe a little bit still doing that sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Alain Elkann interviews.